You have fired 11,000 rounds before anyone let you carry a rifle with a scope into a real position. You have learned to read a hedgerow the way another man reads a sentence, the gap in the leaves that is too regular to be natural, the fence post that throws a shadow half a foot longer than its neighbors, the patch of grass that has been lying flat for exactly the wrong number of hours. You have learned patience as a discipline, not a virtue. One round, one confirmed hit, then you move, because the second shot from the same hide is the one that gets you killed. Your instructors drilled a single sentence into you until it stopped sounding like advice and started sounding like physics. Never fire at what you have not identified beyond doubt. It is late July 1944, in the hedgerow country south of St. Lo, in the tangle of sunken lanes and thick earthen banks the Norman farmers call the bocage. You have been in this position since before dawn, folded into the base of a hedge with your rifle resting on a rolled jacket, watching a gap in the American line where a lane bends around a burned-out barn. You know this ground. You know that American squads move in predictable rhythms after they take a field, and that the men who direct that movement, the ones who point, who kneel to check a map, who raise a hand to hold a column, are worth 10 riflemen each. Your rule holds. Wait for the man who is clearly in command and take him. At 6:40, a helmet rises above the far hedge, 40 meters out, at almost exactly the height and angle a kneeling man would hold his head to glance over cover before ordering an advance. It does not move erratically. It does not bob the way a nervous private's head bobs. It rises with the slow, deliberate control of someone who has done this before and is being careful about it. Your eye finds the curve of the helmet, the shadow beneath its rim where a face should be. You have 4 seconds, maybe 5, before it drops again. You take the shot you were trained to take. The report cracks off the barn wall and rolls away down the lane. And then nothing rises to fall. No cry, no thrashing in the grass, no second helmet ducking for a wounded man. Nothing at all because there was no man. What tipped over the top of that hedge was a private's steel helmet slung on a forked branch and worked from below by a soldier lying flat in the ditch, pulling a length of wire threaded through a hole punched near the rim. You had put a rifle round through 6 ounces of stamped steel and a fistful of straw, and in the half-second it took your brain to register that the target had not fallen the way a body falls. 2 other things happened that you never saw. A corporal 40 meters to your left, watching through field glasses angled precisely at the muzzle flash zone your own instructors had taught you to expect a shot from, marked the flash and the drifting curl of dust your barrel kicked up from the dry hedge bank. And a Browning automatic rifle, already laid on that exact patch of hedge from a covered position, opened up on your hide before you could work the bolt for a second round. This is a story about a shot that was never fired at a man, and a rule so deeply trained into a soldier that he could not help but obey it even when it killed him. The mechanism at the center of it, a helmet on a stick, rigged to rise and tilt like a careless head, was not new in 1944. It was not American in origin, and it was not clever in the way a new invention is clever. It was old, cheap, and almost embarrassingly simple, built from scrap wood, a spare helmet, and a length of wire that a soldier would otherwise have thrown away. German riflemen who survived encounters with it, and later the intelligence officers who debriefed them, kept reaching for the same word to describe how something so crude could beat men who had trained for years. Rätselhaft, enigmatic, a puzzle that refused to resolve even after its mechanics were explained. The question this raises is not really about a helmet. It is about how a military machine built on discipline, patience, and doctrine, a machine that had every right to consider itself the best trained sniping arm in Europe, could be defeated, again and again, by something a corporal built in 20 minutes with a folding knife. How did the most disciplined shooters on the battlefield become the most predictable? To understand why the trick worked, you first have to understand why it should not have. The German sniper of 1944 was not a myth built up after the fact by frightened GIs. He was the product of one of the most deliberate marksmanship programs any army had built to that point, refined across 5 years of continuous combat on 2 fronts, and folded into doctrine that every infantry division was expected to apply. Germany had entered the war with a firm belief, inherited from the trench experience of 1914 to 1918, that a small number of exceptional riflemen could pin down, demoralize, and bleed a much larger force if they were properly trained, properly equipped, and properly patient. By the middle of the war, the Wehrmacht and the Waffen-SS were running dedicated sniper schools, at Wunstorf and elsewhere, that put recruits through months of instruction in ballistics, camouflage discipline, range estimation, and the psychology of concealment before they were ever assigned a scoped Karabiner 98K or a semi-automatic Juyer 43 fitted with a telescopic sight. A leaflet issued by the High Command of the Army in May 1943, titled plainly Instructions for the Training and Employment of Snipers, codified what the Wehrmacht had learned the hard way on the Eastern Front. The sniper was not just a marksman. He was a thinker who happened to carry a scoped rifle. He was told to study terrain for hours before choosing a position, to range every prominent landmark in his field of view, that fence post, that broken tree, that ruined gable, so that when a target appeared between them, he could place his shot without doing the math under pressure. He was told to dig in below ground level, to never fire from a position he could not retreat from invisibly, and above everything else, to value patience. The leaflet was explicit on this point. A sniper who took every shot that came across his sights would be dead within a week. A sniper who let 4 or 5 lesser targets pass to take the 6th would survive, and would be worth more to the army than any number of impulsive marksmen. Training pamphlets emphasized a sequence recruits repeated until it lost all trace of novelty. Observe without being observed, confirm before committing, treat the rifle as the last step in a much longer process of reading the ground. Candidates who fired at plausible but unconfirmed targets during timed drills were routinely washed out regardless of how well they shot on a static range, because the schools understood that raw marksmanship was the easy part. What could not be taught quickly was the temperament to sit motionless in a hedge for 6 or 8 hours on a hunch that a worthwhile target would eventually appear. And that temperament was exactly what the schools spent months cultivating. The terrain of Northwest Europe in 1944 suited this doctrine almost perfectly. The bocage of Normandy, its centuries-old hedgerows grown up over earthen banks 4 and 5 feet thick, turned every field into a kill box with defined entry and exit points. An American officer, describing this country to a wire correspondent, called it a series of fortresses repeating every 100 yards. The forests along the German border, the Huichen above all, offered concealment so complete that entire American regiments would report snipers everywhere and nowhere. German doctrine did not fight this terrain, it was built for it. 3 rules governed the German sniper's conduct, drilled until reflexive. First, fire only at a confirmed high-value target and officer, an NCO, a radio operator, never at movement alone, because an unconfirmed shot wasted the sniper's greatest asset, the enemy's ignorance of his presence. Second, never fire twice from the same position, because a second shot gave a listening enemy the correction he needed to walk a mortar round onto the hide. Third, displace immediately by a pre-scouted alternate route, because predictable movement was as fatal as staying still. These were survival mechanics, and the men who violated them tended not to survive long enough to teach anyone else. The Wehrmacht rewarded this discipline with an institutional marker of skill. The sniper's badge, the Scharfschützenabzeichen, instituted in August 1944 and awarded in 3 classes tied to a soldier's tally of confirmed kills, 20 for the 3rd class, 40 for the 2nd, 60 for the 1st, with its gold cord. A confirmed kill meant one witnessed and vouched for in writing. In the chaos of actual combat, most kills went unwitnessed, so the badge always understated the real toll. It was a badge built entirely around patience rewarded. One name sat at the top of that system, worth knowing before the trick that beat it. Matthias Hetzenauer, a 19-year-old Austrian drafted into the 3rd Gebirgsjäger Mountain Division, fought on the Eastern Front for less than 2 years and finished the war credited with 345 confirmed kills. His longest recorded shot placed at 1,100 meters, a distance at which a standing man through a 4-power carabiner scope is barely a thumbnail's width of shadow. He hit such targets routinely because he had been trained never to fire until certain. Held up in training circles as living proof the doctrine worked exactly as designed, he was the perfect product of an institution built on wait, confirm, fire once, vanish. Interrogation summaries from captured German riflemen on the Western Front describe the same rules in their own words. One rifleman from the Hitler Jugend Division, interrogated near Caen in late July 1944, said he'd been ordered to fire only when he could see the cap badge of an officer or the wire of a radio set. Anything less was a wasted round and a wasted minute, since every shot revealed his position. He had been told to ignore any movement lasting less than 3 seconds. Prisoners consistently described treating every potential target as a test of identification rather than an opportunity. What they rarely described, because their instructors had never needed to teach it, was what to do when those cues had been deliberately manufactured by the other side. The system worked exactly as designed often enough to earn its reputation. One platoon leader's after-action account, preserved in the U.S. Army's Wartime Combat Lesson Series, describes ordering a squad to advance from one hedgerow to another. During the movement, one man was shot by a sniper firing a single round. The entire squad hit the ground and were picked off, in the officer's own words, one, by the same sniper. 1 round, 1 position, multiple kills. That is what German sniper doctrine was engineered to produce, and it is exactly why its eventual defeat by something as crude as a helmet on a stick was not a cheap trick beating an amateur outfit. It was a cheap trick beating one of the most rigorously trained shooting disciplines fielded by any army in the war, which is precisely why the men who survived it could not stop describing it as Rätselhaft. The dummy head did not begin in Normandy, and it did not begin with Americans. Its lineage runs back nearly 30 years, to the static trench lines of the First World War, where both sides discovered independently that a battlefield without movement was a battlefield that rewarded patience over aggression, and that patience could be exploited if you gave a patient enemy something worth waiting for. French infantry along the Artois and Champagne fronts, as early as 1915, began propping crude papier-mâché heads over their parapets on the ends of poles, some fitted with rubber tubing running to a bulb a soldier could squeeze to make the dummy exhale a curl of cigarette smoke. A detail meant less to fool the eye than to fool the mind, since a smoking man reads as relaxed and unaware, and therefore worth shooting. When a German sniper across no man's land put a round through one of these skulls, French observers, sighting through the entry and exit holes, could establish a bearing back to the shooter and call artillery onto it within minutes. It was the British Army, under Major Hesketh Pritchard, that turned this improvised trench habit into a repeatable system. Hesketh Pritchard was one of the most peculiar officers in the British Army of the First World War, an explorer, big-game hunter, first-class cricketer, and novelist who, at nearly 6.5 feet tall, was almost comically conspicuous in a trench. By 1915, he had noticed what no general would say publicly. German riflemen, entering the war with thousands of telescopic-sighted hunting rifles converted for military use, were killing British infantrymen at a rate he called very bad for morale. A single skilled German sniper, he wrote, might easily cause 30 or 40 casualties. In 1916, Hesketh Pritchard founded the first Army School of Sniping, Observation, and Scouting. The dummy head became standard equipment there, refined with convincing skin tones. Mounted on periscope-style rigs, a soldier could work from below the parapet, and paired with an observer watching for muzzle flash the instant a German rifle fired. By war's end, his school was turning out trained snipers at 3 times the rate of any comparable institution in the world. What had not yet crossed, in 1918, was an ocean and 2 decades. The idea that this mechanism would resurface almost unchanged in a war fought by soldiers whose grandfathers had never heard of it. But the technique did not wait 26 years to prove itself again. In the autumn of 1942, in the ruins of Stalingrad, a quiet Soviet hunter from the Ural Mountains named Vasily Zaitsev was hunting a German sniper who had already wounded 2 of his fellow marksmen. Zaitsev and his spotter, Kulikov, narrowed the German's position to a stretch of rubble where Zaitsev had caught the faint glint of a scope. Kulikov raised a helmet on a stick from a shattered window. The German sniper fired at what looked like a confirmed target, then made the one mistake his own doctrine warned him against. He leaned out to check whether the shot had landed. In that fraction of a second, Zaitsev put a round through his head. The technique had now crossed continents and languages. What had not crossed, and what would cost the German army dearly 2 summers later, was the doctrine itself. Every German sniper manual examined by Allied intelligence treats the helmet trick as a known threat. The defense prescribed on paper was simple: do not fire on doubtful targets, verify before engaging. But that solution was already inside the trap, because the better a German sniper became at verifying his target, the more confidently he would fire at a target built specifically to pass his verification. The reason the trick kept working, generation after generation and army after army, comes down to a single, exploitable seam between what a trained eye is built to notice and what a trained mind is willing to question. A sniper's entire skill set is organized around fast, confident target discrimination. The ability to look at a fragment of a human shape through foliage or shadow and decide, in a matter of seconds, whether it is worth a shot. That skill is built by drilling the eye to recognize a narrow set of visual cues. The curve of a helmet, the angle at which a head sits above a collar, the particular stillness then movement rhythm of a man who is trying not to be seen, but has to glance up occasionally to do his job. A well-built decoy does not need to fool the eye completely. It only needs to satisfy those specific trained cues closely enough, for long enough, to draw one shot out of the shooter. Because the entire German doctrine of single-shot discipline meant that a sniper who hesitated too long over an ambiguous target had already failed at his own institution's standards. The decoy did not have to be convincing. It only had to be plausible enough that not shooting felt. To a man trained to take the shot, the instant identification was certain, like the greater error. Look at a photograph of an American M1 helmet from above, and the reason it worked so well as bait becomes obvious. The shape is round, deep, flared slightly at the rear and ears, with a small brim unmistakable through a 4-power scope, impossible to confuse with the German Stahlhelm's squared coal scuttle silhouette. For a German sniper trained on rapid identification, the M1 was a gift and a curse in the same 6 ounces of stamped steel. The gift was that he could identify his enemy at a glance. The curse was that the Americans knew exactly how reliably that glance would be trusted. This is the irony at the center of the mechanism. The doctrine most responsible for the German sniper's effectiveness, patient, single-shot identification, was also what made him predictable the instant someone learned to manufacture certain identification artificially. A jumpy rifleman would have wasted rounds on the decoy and abandoned it. It was precisely the well-trained sniper, taught to trust his own confirmed read, who was most reliably drawn in, because his training told him this particular helmet at this angle was exactly the target he'd been told to wait for. The trick did not defeat German marksmanship. It recruited German training as its own weapon. There is a further layer to why this worked, one that has less to do with doctrine than with how attention functions under prolonged stress. A sniper holding a position for hours is not, contrary to the popular image, in a state of constant heightened alertness. Sustained vigilance of that kind is physiologically impossible to maintain for long stretches. A decoy timed to appear during a natural lull, when a rifleman's threshold for worth a closer look had drifted slightly lower, was working against a mind already primed to seize on the first clear signal after a stretch of ambiguous nothing. The helmet did not have to beat a sniper at his sharpest. It only had to beat him at the moment his training told him he had waited long enough, and his body badly wanted something, anything, to finally happen. What made the mechanism lethal rather than merely embarrassing was what happened in the seconds after the shot, where American units invested the real engineering of the trick. A helmet on a stick by itself only reveals a sniper is somewhere nearby. Without a fast, coordinated method of exploiting that muzzle flash, the information dies as quickly as it is created. American infantry paired the decoy with a spotting team, one soldier working the helmet from cover, one observer with field glasses fixed on the probable flash zone, and a Browning automatic rifle already laid on that arc, ready to fire the instant a bearing was called. Some units rigged two decoys at different points along a hedge, worked in sequence, so a sniper who fired at the first and displaced by his own doctrine would sometimes present himself again to a team now watching a wider arc. The genius of the American version was never the decoy itself. It was recognizing that the doctrine built to make German snipers deadly, one shot, then move, created a narrow, predictable window a coordinated team could exploit almost mechanically. The German system was built to win a contest of individual skill against an unprepared enemy. The American response refused that contest and turned a rifleman's discipline into a set of predictable inputs for a small, rehearsed team. The mechanism spread across the European theater unevenly, adapted by different units to fit different ground, which is part of why so few German after-action reports describe it as a single coordinated program, rather than a persistent, maddening pattern that kept recurring everywhere at once. The Americans had already met the German sniper system once before Normandy, in the long attritional campaign that began with the landings at Salerno in September 1943 and ground north through Cassino, Anzio, and the Gothic Line. The U.S. 36th and 34th Infantry Divisions, fighting through hill country German sniper sections, had dominated since the previous winter, picked up early versions of the helmet decoy through trial and error, raising a helmet on a rifle butt over the rubble of a window frame as a routine first move when entering an unfamiliar street. It was in Normandy, however, that the technique reached its full effectiveness, not only because of the bocage, but because of the sheer density of German snipers concentrated in that small piece of countryside. In the hedgerow fighting south of St. Lo through July 1944, infantry regiments of the 29th and 30th Infantry Divisions adapted the trick almost immediately once soldiers realized how effectively German riflemen were picking off officers and radio operators at the head of advancing squads. Helmets scavenged from casualties or drawn, as spares were mounted on forked branches or bayonet-topped rifles, timed to rise during the pauses when a squad was most likely to be watched. Signal Corps photographs from the period, held in the National Archives, show improvised decoy rigs propped in hedgerow gaps, evidence that by midsummer the technique had become routine enough to be photographed rather than novel enough to write home about. One wartime photograph, preserved in the Getty Images archive, captioned simply, "An American soldier holds his helmet on his rifle to draw fire from enemy snipers in France," shows exactly this. A helmet raised on the muzzle of an M1 Garand, the soldier crouched below with the tired half-smile of a man who has done this many times before. The technique did not stay confined to infantry rifle squads. a Canadian veteran named Parsons, whose oral history was later recorded by Veterans Affairs Canada, described being held up by a German sniper in a tree while driving ammunition to a forward artillery position. His group's response echoed what Hesketh Pritchard had described nearly 30 years earlier. They tied a rope around a hat and hoisted it up a branch from another tree along the line. 10 chances to 1, Parsons recalled. The German would assume someone was climbing up after him and fire. The hat was the target. The shot was the confession. By late summer 1944, the helmet trick was no longer a specialist's tool. It had spread to truck drivers and artillery observers. Ordinary soldiers' wisdom passed the way men pass along advice about sleeping with your boots on. By autumn, as the front moved into the Huichin forest, the mechanism had to adapt to darker, denser terrain where a decoy silhouetted against open sky no longer worked. There was rarely open sky to be silhouetted against. Units fighting through the Huichin from September into December 1944, a campaign that cost the U.S. First Army tens of thousands of casualties in a forest German defenders knew intimately, modified the trick by using decoys at ground level along fire breaks and forest trails, the narrow lanes German snipers favored for their fields of fire. The forest amplified sound strangely, forcing observers to rely more on drifting powder smoke than muzzle flash, a harder read, but worth the effort since conventional counter-sniper fire was failing almost entirely in that terrain. It was in the Huichin that the trick's limits became visible in the plainest terms. Private First Class Daniel Kowalczyk, a 20-year-old rifleman with the 4th Infantry Division from a mill town in Pennsylvania, standing here for the many young soldiers whose records did not survive that campaign in enough detail to be reconstructed with certainty, was killed in late November 1944, not by a sniper drawn out by a decoy, but by one who had learned, after losing his own comrades to exactly this trick, to hold his fire even against what looked like a legitimate target, breaking his own doctrine and simply waiting Kowalczyk's squad out until a real target appeared hours later. The trick's success rate was never total and was never meant to be. War is not decided by tricks that work every time. It is decided by tricks that work often enough to shift the arithmetic of who survives a given afternoon. The trick followed the fighting into the fortress ports of Brittany that same autumn, where the U.S. VII Corps spent 6 weeks reducing the heavily garrisoned port of Brest. The close-range fighting through ruined buildings gave German snipers in upper stories constant opportunity, and squads pushing into a street adapted the idea to house clearing. A helmet sent up first on a bayonet through a broken window told the squad, in one shot or in silence, which building to assault and which to bypass. It did not save every man, but in the streets of Brest, as in the hedgerows further north, the trick saved more than the alternative of clearing every building blind. The Ardennes offensive that opened in mid-December 1944 forced yet another variation. Deep snow made a bare steel helmet stand out too sharply against white ground, so units wrapped decoy helmets in bedsheets or captured German winter smocks, the same materials riflemen used to camouflage themselves. Around Bastogne and St. Vith, where American units were often fighting encircled, officers used the trick more defensively than proactively, drawing fire from infiltrators probing the perimeter after dark to gauge, before dawn, how many positions pressed against a given stretch of line. The cold cut both ways. German riflemen, suffering from exposure and fuel shortages, held positions longer than doctrine recommended simply because displacing meant moving through waist-deep snow, which made a sniper who took the bait easier to fix afterward. He often lacked the strength to relocate quickly once spotted. By early 1945, as the front pushed into the Rhineland and the fighting turned to the rubble of Aachen and the approaches to the Rhine, the mechanism adapted once more to an urban environment, rigged in a shattered window frame or doorway to mimic a soldier scanning a street from cover. Regimental histories describe this variation as effective precisely because German defenders, fighting exhausted, short-handed battalions in the war's final months, were relying more than ever on individual marksmen, which meant the population of snipers still following textbook doctrine, and therefore still vulnerable to it, remained large even as the army around them was collapsing. What corroborates this pattern beyond American unit histories is the testimony of the Germans who survived it. Interrogation summaries from prisoners taken across Normandy and the Rhineland describe a recurring bafflement at how often an unmistakably legitimate target turned out to be fabricated, and a grudging acknowledgement that the Americans had studied exactly which cues a trained rifleman was taught to trust. One captured Wehrmacht sniper noted that the American helmet rose more slowly than a real soldier's head, but at the distance he was firing from, the difference was nearly impossible to detect. Another said he'd been trained to ignore movements lasting only a fraction of a second, but a helmet that hovered for several full seconds practically invited engagement. Several summaries note a growing hesitation among German snipers in the war's final year, men who had begun holding fire even against targets meeting every criterion their training had given them, because they had learned, at the cost of comrades, that certainty itself could be manufactured. Some described passing warnings informally to replacements, an unofficial addendum to doctrine, spread soldier to soldier, cautioning new arrivals to watch a target far longer than the official schools had ever prescribed. That the warning had to travel informally, rather than through the institution that trained them, is itself evidence of how slowly a closed system updates even when its own men are dying to teach it the lesson. A doctrine of decisive engagement, quietly eroded from within by an enemy that had learned to counterfeit the one thing the doctrine depended on. It is worth saying plainly what this bafflement was not. The Germans were not outshot. The American sniper program of the Second World War was, by its own army's later admission, rudimentary. No dedicated sniper school of the kind the Wehrmacht ran at Wunstorf, no equivalent of the sniper's badge, no rifle to match the accuracy of a well-tuned Karabiner 98K or Juyer 43 in a trained hand. The Springfield M1903A4, the closest thing the U.S. Army fielded to a purpose-built sniper rifle, was competent but unremarkable. Man for man, weapon for weapon, the German sniper was very likely the better trained specialist in almost every conventional sense that mattered to the institutions that built him. He was not beaten by a better sniper, a luckier shot, or a flaw in his own marksmanship. He was beaten by an ordinary infantryman holding up an ordinary piece of equipment, while his entire position was reduced to broken earth by a system that did not even need to see him to kill him. He had a category in his training for losing to a better sniper. He had a category for being suppressed by artillery, for being overrun by infantry. He had no category at all for being made obsolete by 6 ounces of stamped steel on a stick, and that is the precise shape of the word Rätselhaft. We tell ourselves the war in the West was won by industrial output and air superiority, by the tonnage of steel and fuel the Allies could put into the field that Germany increasingly could not, by generalship and the strategic weight of numbers. All of that is true, and none of it is the whole story. Underneath the divisions and tonnage figures were smaller arithmetic problems, fought and won or lost one hedgerow, one tree line, one street corner at a time, and in that smaller arithmetic, a helmet on a stick mattered as much as any of it, because it changed the terms of an engagement the Germans had every institutional reason to expect they would win. The German sniping system was closed, a set of rules, however sophisticated, that could not update itself in real time, because updating it meant retraining a cadre of riflemen who were, by the nature of their job, scattered, isolated, and often dead before their hard-won knowledge could travel back up the chain. The American response was radically open, improvised at the squad level, adapted hedge by hedge and forest by forest, spread not through doctrine manuals but through soldiers talking to soldiers, each unit free to modify a working idea the moment the ground demanded it. A closed system, however well built, eventually loses to an open one, not because the open system is smarter in any single instant, but because it learns faster than the closed system can retrain itself. The German schools could, in principle, have adapted. What they could not do was move that knowledge at the speed the front demanded, because the men best positioned to report the lesson were, by the exact nature of the trick, disproportionately the men who did not survive to file it. The mechanism did not die with the war. Its descendants have appeared in nearly every conflict since, wherever a well-trained shooter faces an enemy patient enough to study his doctrine rather than simply outgun him. American and coalition snipers in Iraq and Afghanistan carried purpose-built decoy heads and torsos for drawing insurgent fire in urban environments, resting on the identical logic worked out in Normandy 60 years earlier. Photographs from the fight for Mosul in 2017 show Iraqi federal police raising helmets on sticks to draw Islamic State sniper fire, and the war in Ukraine has produced its own documented wave of decoy soldiers built from mannequins and scavenged uniforms, set along trench lines to draw Russian fire toward ground already zeroed in by counter-battery teams, a near-exact echo of a French trench in 1915. Updated with modern materials but relying on the same exploit. The mechanism endures because what it exploits was never really about equipment. It was about the gap between what a trained mind is confident it knows and what it can actually verify in 2 or 3 seconds. And that gap has not closed in over 100 years of total transformation in how wars are fought. The verdict, when you set the two systems side by side, is not a verdict about courage or even about skill, because the German sniper of 1944 possessed both in genuine abundance. It is a verdict about which side built a system that could learn while it was being shot at, and which side built a system that could only be as good as the training it had received before the shooting started. The Germans had the better trained shooters. The Americans had the better answer. Somewhere along a Norman hedgerow, long after the fighting had moved on and the fields had gone back to pasture, a scavenged helmet still hung from its forked branch where nobody had bothered to take it down, tilted at the same careless angle it had held on the morning it did its work, waiting for an eye that would never look at it again. The rule that made a man deadly was the same rule that told him exactly when to die. And the soldiers who figured that out did not need a factory, a doctrine manual, or a general's order. They needed a helmet, a stick, and the patience to watch what the enemy's own patience would do to him. If this story changed how you think about what actually wins a war, please subscribe and like the channel. We are excavating the history that time tried to bury.